good to come, and I do appreciate that. Thank you so very much. The person who will introduce our speaker for this evening is Captain William A. Coleman, United States Navy, retired. He is also the former Associate Vice President and Director of Human Resources at East Tennessee State University. And he is my dear friend as well. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Captain Coleman, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman Hartzell. It is a pleasure to come back and not have to handle employee hiring and the evaluation paper, but just come back out and introduce a new thing now, and to join you for this evening. I'm as excited as you are. I hope you're excited to hear the speaker. We have the pleasure tonight of having with us, and I want to say Colonel Will Gunn, United States Air Force retired, who has had a brilliant career as a public servant. He's best known for serving as the first ever Chief Defense Counsel for the Guantanamo military commissions. He's a retired Air Force colonel, former military lawyer, former White House fellow, former CEO of a large nonprofit organization, a licensed minister, and now represents military members and veterans of a private law firm. In 2003, he was named the first ever Chief Defense Counsel in the Department of Defense Office of Military Commissions. He built a defense team and supervised all defense activities for detainees selected for trial before military commissions, the first proceedings of their kind to be conducted by the United States in over 60 years. He won acclaim for his principled leadership and commitment to ensuring that detainees received effective representation. In doing so, he set the tone so that the military lawyers under his leadership vigorously defended their clients and brought the Hamden v. Rumsfeld lawsuit, in which the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision invalidating the system set up by President Bush to try accused war criminals at Guantanamo. These efforts radically changed public perceptions about military lawyers and raised international attention on the Guantanamo prison camp. A native of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Colonel Gunn is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and a cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School. While at Harvard, he was elected president of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, the nation's oldest student-run legal services organization. He also has a Master's of Laws degree in environmental law from the George Washington University, another thing we hold in common, and a Master of Science degree in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Gunn retired from the military in 2005 and was named President and CEO of Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Washington, where he led one of the largest affiliates of Boys and Girls Clubs of America with a budget approaching $20 million. Over 10,000 members, a staff of over 250 people, spread out over Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. He chairs the American Bar Association's Commission on Youth at Risk and serves on the board of Christian Services Charities. He's been featured in the New Yorker magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Law Bulletin, and the Travis Smiley radio show. Colonel Gunn has also received many awards and honors, including the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau's Outstanding Alumni Award, the Human Rights Award from the Southern Central Center for Human Rights, and the American Bar Association's Outstanding Career Military Lawyer Award. He has 3 children and has been married, he says, to the same woman for more than 26 years. It's my great pleasure to present to you Colonel Will Gunn, United States Army, United States Air Force, retired.
Thanks. Thanks, Captain Coleman. Dr. Drinker, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank all of you for coming out. I know with it being late April or mid-April, officially tax day today, that there are things that you could be doing other than being here, so I'm honored that you take the time out of your schedule. This is my first time here at East Tennessee State, and I am pleased and honored to be here. This is a treat for me on a number of levels. For one thing, one of the ways that I get energized is by being in academic environments in which I don't have to write papers, or I don't have to receive a grade. So this is fun for me. And they say that if you really want to find what your true calling is, one of the ways that you go about discovering your true calling is by asking yourself, what would I do for free? Or what would I do if money was not a consideration at all? For me, one of those things would involve helping people younger than me to figure out what it is that they should be doing. And so coming here into this environment is an extension of that. And I am pleased, again, and quite honored and just thrilled to be here this evening. So I'm going to take a little time and to deliver some remarks. And then what I hope we'll be able to do is spend some time with questions and answers. Because I believe that's, well, quite frankly, that's my favorite part. And since I'm here and I've taken some time out to come from Washington, D.C., I want to have some fun here this evening. All right? I like doing things in an interactive manner, so let me ask you, do we have anyone here younger than 18? Okay, no one here younger than 18, so good. By a show of hands, how many people remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center? Very good. There are some moments in time that are defining, that change or define a generation. For some people of an earlier time, December 7th, 1941 was such a moment. That was the day that there was an attack on the United States base at Pearl Harbor. For me, as a preschooler, I can still remember the television being on and getting an announcement on November 22nd, 1963, when there was an announcement that the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, had just been shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. And I'm told that many people of my generation and of the generation before mine remember that as a pivotal event. I dare say that for people of most of your generation, and for actually everyone in this room, September 11th, 2001 represents such a defining moment. I bring that up not only because it relates to my remarks, but I have a central premise this evening, and that is that a true measure of a man, the true measure of a woman, the true measure of a nation is determined by how that individual or how that entity responds in times of pressure. It's easy to be the person that you want to be when there's nothing on the line, when everything is going well. But when things aren't going well, when you are threatened, how do you respond? Really determines the person that you are. In the case of a nation, it determines what that nation actually is. Let me just start by saying, as someone who has spent, I guess, more than half of my life in uniform, I am proud to be an American. But my country is a complex one. The complexity is most easily identified in those times of pressure. Dr. Drinker tells me that she is a member of the history department here and that she asked many of her students, she asked all of her students in her classes in African American history and the United States history to attend. And while I wasn't a history major, history is a favorite topic of mine. And so I've looked at certain events in U.S. history, and certain ones speak out to me with respect to this pressure component. For example, in the late 1850s, there was a Supreme Court case, a famous Supreme Court case called the Dred Scott decision. And Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken into free territory and who sued to gain his freedom from his master. And the case went back and forth through the courts for a number of years. But finally it made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wrote the decision. And that decision, the Dred Scott decision, was written by Chief Justice Taney. And Chief Justice Taney said some words in that decision that have stayed with me ever since I heard them more than 20 years ago. And that was that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. Political scholars of that era said that that decision had less to do about slavery and about property rights, as the Supreme Court tried to frame it, as it did about the court's desire and the court's attempt to avoid a war by presenting a decision that they believed would be most politically advantageous. In World War II, the President of the United States signed an order that basically allowed for the internment of Japanese Americans on the west coast of the United States. It didn't matter that people that were interned were American citizens. What mattered was the fact that the United States had been attacked by the Japanese, and there was fear that there could be an invasion into this country by the Japanese. And so in order to avoid confusion, in order to avoid this country being attacked from within, they allowed, the president signed an order and the United States government allowed the internment of its own citizens. September 11th in Guantanamo represents a different type of challenge. Al-Qaeda took credit for the flights into the World Trade Center. And so the President of the United States said that those people that were taken hostage in what has become to be known as the global war on terrorism would be confined in Guantanamo Bay. And since that time, since late 2001, this name Guantanamo has conjured up all types of images. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about that. But I want to do it in a different way. I want to talk to you from a very personal perspective. And in order to do that, I want to take you back to actually May of 2002, about 9 months after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on basically what I'd call a field trip. I was a student at the school called the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at the time. And my class and I, we were there in Buenos Aires, and the Argentine economy was going through great stress at that particular time. Unlike our economy, the Argentine economy has gone through several periods of great stress over the years. But in December of 2001, in Argentina, the Argentine dollar had been pegged to the US dollar before that time. And there was a great crisis to the extent that what had been a one-to-one comparison, one Argentine dollar to one US dollar, basically the system collapsed such that things that were costing, let's say $100 US, were now costing only $33 in Argentina. So it was a 1-to-3 devaluation, which meant that there were some great bargains to be had in Argentina. Well, my class, our purpose was to study Argentine industry. And we'd been there for a few days, and after a hard day of going back and forth, looking at various factories, and then getting some downtime to go and to do some serious shopping, I went into an internet cafe. And when I went into the internet cafe, I got a message. And the message stated that there was someone in the office of the Department of Defense General Counsel that wanted to interview me for the Chief Defense Counsel job. I looked at this message, and then I took another look, and I was quite frankly disturbed. For one thing, I had no idea what they were talking about. I previously served as a defense counsel in the military, but I had left that all behind. I had a mentor who had offered me a job working in the Pentagon when I finished this particular program I was enrolled in, and I was due to complete the program in just over a month. So I was focused on what I was going to be doing next. I already had my follow-on assignment, and this message about a Chief Defense Counsel job just didn't make any sense. So I did some thinking, and I made some phone calls, and I was able to confirm that they were talking about the possibility of me going to serve as the first defense counsel, Chief Defense Counsel, in this Office of Military Commissions. I was not pleased. I wasn't pleased basically because I did not see how this could in any way enhance my career. If you can think back to the fact that in May of 2002, the United States was at a far different place than it is today. At that particular time, the notion of defending Al-Qaeda was far from many people's mind. In fact, as I talked to people in that particular era, the typical response was closer to along the lines of defend them. We should just line them up and shoot them. Of course, today, that wouldn't be an acceptable reaction, perhaps, at least not in many circles. But in May of 2002, it wasn't an unusual reaction at all. By virtue of me being enrolled in the school that I was enrolled in, by virtue of my follow-on assignment to the Pentagon, my superiors in the Air Force JAG Corps were signaling that they wanted to give me the opportunity to compete to become a general officer. I was a colonel at the time, was a brand new colonel, and being a general in the armed forces is a really big deal. And so just the idea that I'm going to go and defend the sworn enemies of the United States, this did not seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. So again, I reached out to people, I reached out to mentors, I talked to my parents, I talked to my pastor at church, I talked to friends, and I sought out feedback on what I should do. And it was so interesting because the feedback that I received fell neatly into two different camps. One camp was basically the camp that I would call the I don't know camp. Should I take it? Well, I don't know if you should. That was one camp. Those were the strong supporters. Then there was another camp, a larger camp, that said you should avoid it at all costs. In fact, if offered the job, you should run in the opposite direction as fast as you possibly can. Why? Because it's a no-win situation. If you do a good job, there are going to be people that consider you to be a traitor to your nation. If you do a poor job, there are going to be people that consider you to be a traitor to your profession. And what are you going to think about yourself? So rather than dealing with this dilemma, just avoid it. I talked to a mentor of mine who told me that, one thing that I could do was go in and basically throw the interview. Let them know that I wasn't interested in the job. And so make myself a non-candidate. Well, the day for my first big interview came. And initially, when I found out that they wanted to interview me for the job, the word that I got was that as soon as I got off the plane, they wanted me to stop by the Pentagon and be interviewed right away. Well, it ended up being about 2 or 3 weeks later before I actually went in for the interview. And I was asked that fateful question as to whether or not I was a volunteer for the job. To put this in context, it said that when a person is drowning or faced with imminent loss of life, or what they perceive to be imminent loss of life, their whole life flashes before their eyes. In this particular instance, when I was asked this question, my whole career flashed in front of my eyes. But I answered the question carefully. And I said that while there were other things that I had in mind for my military career, that if I was chosen for that position, I would serve, and I would serve to the best of my ability. I was initially told that the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, wanted to make a decision with respect to various key positions with respect to military commissions right away. And then, as it turned out, that right away ended up being about 8 months. So there was a period of about 8 months that transpired from the time that I had my first interview to the time that I was initially offered the job. By the time that I was offered the job in February of 2003, my attitude had changed somewhat. My attitude was basically that if I'm the one that's selected for that position, then I am going to serve to the best of my ability. And not only that, I believe that I'm a good fit in that I believe strongly in this nation, and I believe in this nation's system of values. And because I do, being placed in the position of having to uphold the position by holding the nation to its own standards was not a position that I wanted to shy away from. So I was eventually offered the job, and I was given and I accepted it, and I was given some office space in the basement of the Pentagon. Well, not the basement, on the first level of the Pentagon. And the office space that I was given was scheduled for renovation shortly thereafter. And they were clearing it out, but I had some office space. I was the only person in this particular office that was large enough to hold about 20 different people. It had workstations for about 20 different people. And each day, as I was going to the restroom, I would walk by a portion of the Pentagon that had been damaged in the attack of September 11th. For those of you that don't know, during the attacks of September 11th, when the plane hit the Pentagon, it went into a section that had recently been renovated. And one of the goals that had been stated was that we want to get this back up, we wanted to get the building repaired, and we wanted to get this particular portion restored as soon as possible. But this particular portion had a plaque that was hanging there. It was close to the interior-most portion of the Pentagon, and there was a plaque that was hanging on the wall. And this plaque read as follows: Terrorists can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. Terrorists can shake the foundation of our biggest building, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. That particular quote was from a speech given by President George Bush on the night of September 11, 2001. And so each day as I was walking past this, I had an opportunity to reflect on that and reflect on the job that I'd been given, that of defending people confined in Guantanamo Bay who were accused of committing acts of terrorism against the United States. One of the realizations that I came to, or I don't know if it was a realization as much as it is just a meditation that I had, was that when I think about the foundation of America, I think about some founding documents. I think about the Constitution. I think about the Declaration of Independence. I think about the rule of law. One of the things that I learned in history and I learned as I was growing up was that this country is based upon a notion that no person is above the law. We're not a monarchy where the king is above the law. The law here is king. I was moved by that because it took me back to my childhood and when I first started to think about philosophy and political thought, and I was thinking about a rhetoric course that I had as a high school senior. It was a college review English course. And my teacher was brilliant, and she had us studying the Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And she had us studying the I Have a Dream speech. And one of the realizations that I had was that the power and the force of Dr. King was made possible by the fact that he appealed to America's values. He appealed to the founding documents. He didn't just appeal to fairness. He appealed to the notion that my country, this is who you say you are. This is what you say about yourself. So in this time of turmoil, are you going to be true to who you say you are? And I looked at that and I meditated on that and I got comfort for the position that I was placed in. My job was involved selecting a team of lawyers, and I was able to get to assemble a brilliant team, not due to any great skill on my part, but due to the fact that military lawyers, the judge advocate generals or the JAGs had nominated lawyers that they believed in, lawyers that believed in the rule of law, lawyers that believed that making sure that we had a fair system, making sure that whatever we did could withhold the test of time, that was vital. And so I had lawyers from all the branches of the service. I had Marine Major Maury. I had two Navy lawyers, Lieutenant Commander Philip Sundell and Navy Lieutenant Commander Charlie Swift, who eventually sued the President of the United States and took a case all the way to the Supreme Court. I had Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Sharon Schaefer, and I also had Army Lieutenant Colonel Mark Bridges. These people were around me, and together we started building a team. We started studying human rights law. We started studying humanitarian law. We studied what the what the Geneva Conventions called for. And we prepared. And along with preparation came some tests. One test that I was faced with occurred in my very first year in the job, in December of 2003. The lawyers on my staff came to me and said that there's a case that's pending before the Supreme Court. It's the Rasul decision. It's a Rasul case. And in Rasul, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case. And the issue is whether or not the detainees in Guantanamo should be able to test their confinement in federal courts in the United States. One reason that people were being confined at Guantanamo rather than in the United States or in some other location was because of the fact that Guantanamo is sovereign territory of the Cuban government. I don't know if you've thought about this, but if you've looked at where Guantanamo is actually located, if you look at Cuba, in some respects, it's a rough approximation of this state, the state of Tennessee. And in the bottom corner, in the bottom right-hand corner, near the southernmost point, is Guantanamo. And surrounded on all sides is the nation of Cuba. And in fact, the base itself is Cuban territory, belongs to the Cuban government. The United States just obtained a lease from Cuba in the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. So there was a thought, there was legal precedent for the notion that because this wasn't U.S. territory, that it's overseas, and so anyone that's confined there has no right to contest their confinement in a United States court with a writ of habeas corpus. And that's what this case was testing, that notion. The lawyers that worked for me came to me and said, "Boss, we need to submit a brief to the United States Supreme Court arguing that the detainees should be able to contest their confinement in federal court." Quite frankly, I wasn't thrilled about this notion. I wasn't thrilled about the notion for much the same reason that I wasn't thrilled when I first heard that I was being considered to be the chief defense counsel. The idea of assigning other people to cases was one thought. But the idea that now we're going to advocate before the United States Supreme Court a position that's directly contrary to the position that's being advocated by the President of the United States, by the Justice Department, and by the Solicitor General of the United States was not something that I was particularly comfortable with. But because of my position, I invited the lawyers that worked for me to meet with me and present their case as to why we should do this. And they brought along a professor from Georgetown University Law School, Professor Neil Keitel, and they made the case as to why this made sense. And so I asked the question as to, well, why not some other group? Why does it need to be the military lawyers sending in what's called an amicus brief? And they said, well, because if it's the military lawyers, then that brief is likely to be taken very seriously by the United States Supreme Court because it's going to be unexpected. Who would anticipate that military lawyers would be the ones advocating greater rights for the detainees? I listened, and I was convinced that it was the right thing to do. And so I invited my staff to make a formal request to me, a letter, in the form of a letter, and I would take that up to senior ranking lawyers at the Pentagon. They did it, and I took their request forward, and eventually we received the okay to go forward, but not without some consternation. But nevertheless, we received the okay. Another moment, another interesting moment from my perspective is when I was in New York City on my spring break in 2004, and I get a phone call from the press office at the Pentagon asking me if I knew that one of my lawyers had just filed a case in federal court challenging the detention of Mr. Salim Hamdan, Mr. Salim Hamdan was an admitted driver for Osama bin Laden. And so, under the rules that the President of the United States had promulgated, it said that you're not to challenge these, this particular document in federal court. And my lawyer, who worked for me, had done exactly this. And so I'm being asked if I knew. Well, we had an interesting discussion with respect to that and went forward. But it was a testing moment. My entire job, as I look at it, I was not allowed to represent any of the detainees. My job was to assign counsel. My job was to oversee the process. My job essentially was to set the tone for the type of representation that the detainees would receive. And during the course of that time, I had some interesting experiences, especially with the press, both domestic press and international press. For one thing that I'd like to share before we get to questions concerns another incident, and something that I think is important for the students to grasp. Life would be so wonderful to a certain extent if we knew when we were going to be challenged by tough moments. If they came with flags waving, saying this is a tough exam. School is nice from that perspective. You know, at the beginning of a course, you get a syllabus. And the syllabus tells you about whether or not there's going to be a midterm, and it tells you about the final, and it tells you whether or not there's a major paper due, and that sort of thing. Life isn't like that. Life throws you pop quizzes all the time. Particularly pop quizzes in terms of who are you? Not just who you say you are, but who are you? I was fortunate because I had history on my side. I had other individuals that I could look to see how they had stood up in times of pressure. For instance, did you know that the second president of the United States, John Adams, was a lawyer, and around 1775, in Boston, he represented individuals, British soldiers, that were involved in what came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Adams was a successful lawyer, but he was approached by someone who said, look, you have to represent this guy. There is this guy, this Captain Preston. He's being accused of firing on this crowd. He never had a weapon. He never gave any orders, but people want to hang him. They want to put him to death. Adams represented him. Even though he was a great leader in the Patriot movement, even though it would put his practice at risk. But looking back on it years later, after representing him and after gaining an acquittal in the case, he called it one of the manliest things that he had done in his entire life. It's interesting that one of the entries in his diary says that his wife, Abigail Adams, that when she heard that her husband was going to be representing the British, considering the climate in Boston at the time, she burst out in tears because she knew what it could possibly mean for a husband and for a family. I had another lesson from history on my side that I was able to contemplate. In 1942, less than a year after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany sent some soldiers to the U.S. and they landed in a couple of different locations. They were dropped off, and a few landed on Long Island, New York, and a few landed off near Jacksonville, Florida. Their mission was to commit acts of sabotage against U.S. industry. One of the individuals thought better of the idea, so he sought out the FBI and turned himself in. And after convincing the FBI that what he was saying was true, that there was a plot and they were able to get to the U.S.'s shores, the FBI succeeded in rounding up the rest of the saboteurs. And the Attorney General of the United States approached the president and said that, you know, we could bring these people to trial in U.S. court, but under our laws, there's very little that we could do with them. Their options under the law were very limited. And they could possibly get a few years of confinement, but that was it, a few years in jail. The president felt that it was necessary that these people get the death penalty. And so he looked for other options. And one option that was proposed to him was that they have what are called military commissions, the same type of military commissions that were authorized 60 years later in 2001. Under these military commissions, there was in the order for the military commissions, there was language that said that these cases could not be challenged in a United States court. There was an Army colonel that was assigned to represent these saboteurs. And this individual's name was Colonel Kenneth Royale. And he was a reserve colonel from North Carolina. And he had another active duty colonel who was also a lawyer, who was also assigned to his team by the name of Colonel Dowdell. They looked at this order and they thought that, well, this is unconstitutional. You can't deprive people of the right to challenge their confinement in a United States court. And so, being a loyal soldier, Colonel Dowdell and Colonel Royale, they wanted to contact the President of the United States and get permission to challenge the cases in federal court. And so they wrote a letter to the President of the United States, sent it up through channels, and didn't hear anything. Finally, they got a message back that said, do what you believe you have to do. Think about it. Do what you think you have to do. You're in uniform. You have an obligation to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. You are sworn to protect this nation. You are taught to obey orders. And the Commander-in-Chief has told you not, on the one hand, not to challenge these cases in federal court. And on the other hand, you're being told, do whatever it is that you believe you have to do. Well, they did. They challenged the cases. The Supreme Court heard them. And in a case called In re Quirin, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the military commissions were legitimate. It's interesting, the United States Supreme Court was so eager to rule that they said that these commissions are lawful. We'll follow later with our decision. So they announced it, but there was nothing in writing to back it up. It was only after several of these individuals were executed that the Supreme Court later released its opinion, its written opinion. Years later, Justice Frankfurter, one of the justices, said that it's a lot more difficult to justify your decision when you're trying to work backwards. And essentially what he was pointing out is that because they had already reached their conclusion, now they were tasked with writing it out. And they found that as they wrote it out, it was a lot more difficult to rationalize that particular decision. But because I had Colonel Royale's example from 60 years before, it was somewhat easy for me when Commander Swift filed his case, and we eventually took it to the United States Supreme Court. As I said earlier, I had a lot of different experiences in my role, and so I do want to get to the questions, but I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts. One, I had a lot of interaction with the press during that period of time. One of the most fascinating was an interaction that I had with a reporter from a British show from the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, called Newsnight. And the Newsnight reporter came over to the Pentagon and spent several hours with me, interviewing me. And before the interview was over, this reporter asked me a question that I hadn't been asked before. He said something along these lines. He said, "Colonel Gunn, you spent all these years in uniform, and now you have this job of defending sworn enemies of the United States, terrorists." He said, "Colonel Gunn, are you a patriot?" I was struck by that question. But I don't know if you've ever had this incident happen to you. You know, every now and then you may be asked something, somebody approaches you with something, and you just have the perfect comeback for them. Have you ever had that happen to you? I had it happen to me. The only thing is, it didn't occur until that night when I woke up. The thought that I had when I woke up took me back to a quote that Thomas Paine, an American patriot from the Revolutionary era, had stated, and that was that he who would have his own liberty secure must guard even his enemies from oppression. For if he forsakes that duty, he establishes a precedent that reaches to himself. He that would have his own liberty secure must guard even his enemies from oppression. I wish I'd said it then, but it's still with me now. The other thought that I have is simply this. You may be faced, like me, with certain situations that you would rather not be faced with. They may be moments of personal crisis, professional crossroads, and you all of a sudden may be face to face with an element called fear. And there was a general officer who was promoting one of the lawyers that worked for me, and he brought to my attention a quote that has stayed with me over the last several years. And he pointed to the remarks of a gentleman who was a manager of a folk rock band back in the 1960s. This individual wrote under the pseudonym of Ambrose Redmoon. And he said simply that courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than that fear. It doesn't matter that you're confronted with fear. It's just a matter of how do you confront it and how do you overcome it. Thank you.